mic tonight.
Thanks. How's everybody doing?
All right.
Good. Good. Nice, cold, crisp Midwestern night, which I like, so it's good. I'd like to start out with a little bit about my own story. As you can tell, our projector's not really working right now. So the PowerPoint's really more for me than anybody else, just to keep me on track. So don't really worry about anything that is not being projected. And you could probably see this anyway, so that's fine. But a little bit about my own story. As Lauren just said, I run this thing called BustedHalo.com, but for 10 years of my life, I was a radio producer in New York City and did some radio reporting as well as I went around New York covering various sporting events. I basically wanted to be Marv Albert. Yeah, without the bad wig, of course. And there was one night when I was out covering a Nets basketball game. I happened to be playing your lovely Chicago Bulls. And I walked into the locker room. My job was to basically go into the locker room and interview anybody who you can talk to and bring the actualities either back to the station or feed them back down to a phone line at that point in time to different people. This is all done with computers now. They're so lucky. And I walked into the locker room one night, and the first person I ran into was Michael Jordan himself. It was the night that was a crazy night of basketball where someone had broken a backboard, and it took about 45 minutes for them to wheel another thing out, and they actually had to hammer in a new rim in the blackboard. And long story short, we interviewed Jordan, me and a few other guys for about 15 minutes, and then I walk over to the phone and I call my assignment editor and I said, yeah, I have some Jordan cuts for you. And he just goes, Michael Jordan? And I said, yeah. He goes, he never talks. And I was like, no, he was fine, he was cool. And he was like, really? And I said, yeah. And he goes, you should be much more excited about this than you are. And I was like, well, that might be true. And I said, yeah, to me it really wasn't a big deal, and I kind of let it go. And when I got home that night, I talked to my roommate, and he goes, oh, how's basketball game? I was like, oh my gosh. I said, it was 45 minutes longer than it needed to be. I spent all this extra time afterwards. I had talked to my assignment editor about something. And oh, and by the way, I interviewed Michael Jordan. And he just looked at me and he was like, did you just say you interviewed Michael Jordan? And I said, yeah. And he goes, you should be much more excited about this. And I was like, yeah, I know. And he said, you know, what happened? What did he say to you? And I said, well, we just talked about the stupid backboard. I said, we didn't really, talk about anything of any consequence. And he said, but you interviewed Michael Jordan. And I said, yeah, I know. Right. Can you get past the Michael Jordan thing, please? And he said, okay, fine. And for the rest of the week, I kind of sat back and was like, okay, let me just think about what just happened. I interviewed possibly the most famous basketball player known to man, which for most people in that field, that's not really that big a deal. I mean, that happens to a lot of guys, especially anybody who's covering the Bulls on a regular basis on, an everyday basis for them. So the novelty sort of wears thin after a couple of times that you've done this. But to most people, it was a big deal, and we shouldn't really minimize that in some ways either. The second part about the story is that I was complaining that I had to stay too long at a basketball game. Everybody else's hobby was my job in a way, and I started to complain when things just really weren't going as quickly or as easily. I was looking forward to getting home to be with, at that point, my roommate or with my family if I was staying with my parents for a weekend or whatever, more than I was at my job at that point in time. So I kind of noticed that and said, oh, well, this is what I went to school for. This is the way life is. Sometimes things don't work out the way we'd like them to. And I just kind of moved on and just kind of kept that in the back of my mind, but kept sort of pressing forward. I left the sports radio station I worked with and went to go and work with a talk radio station where we talked about everything from politics to food to psychology to whatever. And I ended up, one of the last things I did when I was in radio was I produced a food show. And the food show was hosted by this man named Arthur Schwartz. And I remember one day we were doing something on the air, and something just didn't quite go right. And he hit his talk back to me and said, wow, that was a really great segment. And I said to him, you're joking, right? And he goes, no, really, I thought that was really good. And I said, well, it could have been better if I had only done X. And he goes, Michael. And I said, what? And he said, You're a good Catholic boy, I'm a good Jewish boy. We've got enough guilt to sink a ship. Please, leave it alone. This was fine. And I said, okay, fine. Later on the same day, he came over to me and he said, you know, last week you had a lot of energy. And he goes, and this week seems, you know, you seem to be a little down. And he said, is something going on? I said, well, you know, do you mean that this change in my character is something where I've gone from being really high to something really low? He said, no, actually, the really low part for you is the norm. He said, the really high part was what was surprising. He said, what did you do last week? I said, well, actually, I was on a retreat. I said, I've been leading retreats in my parish for the last 3 or 4 years. I said, I learned how to do this when I was at Fordham College. And I said, and it really is something that brings me a lot of life. And he said, I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I said, okay, what? And he said, you're a good producer. He said, you really are. I love having you around. You're really great to be around. You're a lot of fun. You give me more energy as a host. He said, but I don't think this is what you're called to do. And I said, well, gee, thanks, I think. And he said, no, I'm not trying to get rid of you. I'm not going to go to the program director and say, hey, this guy really shouldn't be here. He said, but I love you. And he goes, and I just want to say that I think you're called to do more than produce my silly little radio show every day. And he said, for me, this is what I'm called to do. And he goes, and if I even think it's a silly little radio show, that should tell you something. And he said, I was where you are. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I worked for a newspaper for 100 years. And he said, and I hated going into that office building every single day. He goes, it was too big, there were too many people, I couldn't keep anything straight. And he said, but it was how I made my living. And he goes, and I love writing about food. He goes, it was the office building that I really didn't like. And he said, so I went to a career counselor and I said to her, this is the situation I'm in, the job that I'm in is driving me up the wall. I do this little radio show, it's about an hour a day. And he goes, and that's okay. He goes, I kind of enjoy doing that, it's a nice rest. I get to leave my office building and go to a smaller office building and talk to myself in a room for an hour. And he goes, and a few other people who call in. He goes, and that's fine. So he said, she asked me, he said, what I thought was a rather daunting question. I said, what's that? She said, Arthur, if you could do anything tomorrow, what would that be? And Arthur said, well, I suppose I could try to change the world by being a doctor or maybe some kind of a lawyer or something. She said, no, Arthur, stop. She goes, this isn't what I mean at all. She said, what I mean is that you don't have to do a job, you don't have to do anything. Just how would you spend your time? And he goes, well, I couldn't do anything. I mean, I have to pay my mortgage, I have to do X, Y. She said, no. Take all of that out of the equation. She said, you don't have to do anything tomorrow. Just be. There are no pressures, there's nothing to do. She said, you just have to exist. How will you spend your time? And he said that at first he couldn't answer it, and then after a little while he came back to her and he said, oh, this is easy. And she said, what do you mean? He goes, I know exactly how I'd spend all my time. And she said, well, what do you think you'd do? He goes, I'd stay at home, I'd sit in my underwear, and I'd laugh at my own jokes. Now, as trite as that might be, she looked at him without blinking an eye and said, Arthur, guess what? She goes, you're a writer, you can do this. And he was like, well, lo and behold, what do you know? I could do this. And she said, but let's get at why you want to do this. You know, what is all this about?